on selfishness, we really can't have proper relationships. Well, staying kind of with that theme of selfishness, I want to talk talk a little bit about conflict resolution. And then after we talk about some things with conflict, the next thing that we'll talk about is understanding each other's perspectives. John Gottman calls it attunement. Courtney Armstrong calls it alignment. I use an acronym where I call LOVE, but we'll kind of go in that sequence. 70%, I think the actual statistic is 69 and some change, but 70% of all marital problems are unsolvable. I'll just let that good news sink in. 70% of all marital problems are unsolvable. Now, last week we talked about that marriage go-round. You end up in romance, and from romance you run into reality. And in reality, that's where the problems come. And when we encounter problems, we're tempted to quit. We're tempted to recycle. And so I want you to think in terms of, if problems are unsolvable, what we've discovered, and this is a lot of research done by Buhlman and by a guy named John Gottman, that it's really the problems in relationships are really, they don't matter. It's how you treat each other while you're dealing with the problems. And so rather than get caught up in what, we need to really concentrate on the how. I heard a guy named Matt Evans give this illustration. He did a 4-part series called I'm Not a Quitter. And in one of the things that he did this illustration. So let's suppose that I brought in a 30-pound dumbbell and said, your job today is to carry this dumbbell all day. You can't put it down. You can't rest it on the table. It has to be carried by you all day. Could you anticipate any problems with that? It's going to get in my way at Chick-fil-A. It's going to be a problem when I drive. It's going to ruin my cell phone, okay? There's all kind of things that we can anticipate if you give me this dumbbell and I've got to carry it all day. It doesn't do me good. What if I said I'm going to give you a backpack and you carry that dumbbell all day? Now, I didn't change the size of the dumbbell. I didn't make it not be metal, and I didn't make it weigh less than 30 pounds. I didn't change the what. I just adjusted the how. And most everybody here, your face changed when I said, what if you had to carry it in a backpack? And everybody realized if I had 2 straps and a bag on there, I could manage 30 pounds pretty easy. It's not the what, it's the how. So when we start talking about dealing with conflict or dealing with each other in conflict, we really want to change the how that we view conflict, the how that we view each other, and actually the how of our interaction in conflict. John Gottman did research years ago with the University of Washington. He says he can sit in a room with a couple, listen to them discuss a problem, and predict divorce with 95% accuracy after 10 minutes. And all he does is listens to how they talk to each other. He's got his graduate students now coding facial expressions. He watches how the eyes move, watches how the face moves, particularly looks for signs of the dimpler muscle on one side of your face. Anytime you get a facial expression that's asymmetrical, it's not pleasant, and it usually indicates somebody's probably lying too. But when you get that dimpler muscle, that's a sign of contempt. He said once we see that happening in a relationship, it almost like stick a fork in it, we're done. The 4 markers that I look for when I'm dealing with a couple, John Gottman calls them the 4 horsemen of the relationship apocalypse. And I think that's a pretty good deal there. So we'll talk about those tonight. And as we go through, I want to kind of remind you that as we talk about these things, the biblical basis for this is, number 1, not being selfish. And number 2, let's read just a couple of verses, and then we'll talk about the other part. If you want to follow along, go to Ephesians chapter 4. And Paul's just writing to the Christians in Ephesus, and he's giving them just some general rules for interaction. Verse 25 of Ephesians 4, therefore let each of you put off falsehood and speak truthfully to his neighbor, for we are all members of one another. In your anger, do not sin, and do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. He who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with his own hands, that he may have something to share with those in need. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, brawling, slander, along with every form of malice, and be kind, compassionate to one another, forgiving one another, just as God in Christ forgave you. Similar verses are going to be in Colossians 4:6. Let your conversation always be with grace, seasoned with salt. Romans chapter 12, if you read that whole chapter about how to deal with angry people, number 1, he says, don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So if we talk about the things that interfere with relationships, the number 1 thing that we look for is the presence or the absence of contempt. Now, contempt can be something that you actually are dealing with, or it can be that I just perceive it. If you've ever dealt with a teenager, things that they say you perceive as disrespectful, and they think they're just talking to you like they do their buds at school, right? How many of you have told a teenager, don't use that tone of voice with me, and they roll their eyes at you? Go, what tone? Right? So sometimes we say things to people, and they perceive it as contemptuous, and we don't really mean it, but it doesn't really matter. If I'm actually dealing in it, or if I'm perceiving that it comes, contempt it erodes the foundation of a relationship. I like to distinguish contempt from the idea, are you talking about the problem, or are you talking about the person? A complaint talks about the problem. A criticism talks about the person. It's deer season in Alabama. It's been deer season since October 15th. I'm self-employed. My boss is easy to convince I need part of a day off. So I do spend some time in the woods. A lot of mornings before daylight I'm gone. A lot of evenings I don't come in until after dark. And let's suppose that Miss Jones gets unhappy with that and wants it to change. She can say, you're never home. Or she could say, I wish we spent more time together. Now, we're talking about the same problem. Shake your head this way. But you see how one of those things builds a bridge and one of those things builds a barrier. So the first thing that happens when you run into conflict is start thinking about, am I making a positive request to have my needs met, or am I attacking or assaulting the other person? I'm asking you to meet my needs, not telling you that you're doing something wrong. I wished our house was better organized. Well, you're a sloppy housekeeper. You see the difference in those two things. So really it boils down to, it's really not what you say, but how you say it. And it's not what you say, but why you say it. You know, when Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 5, that you've heard it said by those of old, you shall not murder. But I say to you that whoever looks at his brother and is angry with him without a cause and says, Rekah, you'll be in danger of the judgment. Whoever says, you fool, you'll be in danger of hellfire. You know, my dad was really strict on that we couldn't call each other a fool. And my brother had good reasons to call me a fool growing up. I was kind of a rowdy kid. But really, Jesus is not talking about the specific words Rekah or fool. Rekah is an Aramaic word that means empty-headed one. And Jesus is really not talking about don't say those words. He's talking about the motivation behind how you can look at somebody who's created in the image of God and call them a fool or empty-headed or a dweeb or a dork or a queer or insert your racial slur. Jesus says it's not what you say, but why you say it. So once I start talking to you about something I'm unhappy with, and by the way, gentlemen, ladies point out things that they're unhappy with because they believe in the value of the relationship and they want it to improve. But men hear those kind of things, they go, I'm a failure, I'm a loser, she's never happy with anything. Ladies bring up things they're unhappy with because they want it to improve, and men just kind of try to avoid all that kind of stuff. And so you end up with this dynamic that she's telling you, I want us to be better, and you hear, I'm a miserable failure. And so your perception of that is sometimes very important. Humans, as a rule, exchange emotional heat. If somebody comes to you and there's a conflict and they're yelling, we tend to yell back. If they're standing aggressive, we tend to posture. If you change any of that, if you start whispering or sit down, you'll change the dynamic of that relationship. But what happens, if you're in the backyard throwing a baseball and you throw the ball to me and it stings my hand, what do I do? What's my next throw look like? I send you a little heat back, right? Now, do you get the message that I thought you threw the ball too hard and I'm trying to get you to slow down? No, what do you do with that next throw? And it's like Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny. I've got a rifle. I've got a cannon. I've got a bazooka. I've got a rocket launcher, and it just starts escalating, and eventually you break a window. But if somebody throws you a ball and it hurts, you can roll it back to them. They say, hey, what was wrong with that? Let's slow it down. And by the way, sometimes you throw me a ball and I catch it in the wrong part of my glove, and it hurts my hand. It had nothing to do with how you threw it. It had everything to do with how I caught it. Now, what happens when somebody is dealing in contempt, or somebody feels like they're dealing with contempt, we enter into this emotional state of our brain that causes us to be defensive. Somebody approaches you, and it feels like an assault. We talked to the cadets at the police academy about an assault cue. When you get an assault cue, you get your body goes into that fight or flight response. And in the fight or flight response, you've done something different in your brain. You've moved from that part of your brain that separates you from the animals and are in that part of your brain that you're really similar to the animals. If this is your brain and this is your limbic system and all your emotions, and then you fold that over and this is your prefrontal cortex, this part right here is the reason we do experiments on monkeys and monkeys don't do experiments on us. But when you get in a highly charged emotional state, that thing goes to sleep and you're back here in this limbic system where you're doing emotional thinking. And emotional thinking, when you move into that emotional part of your brain, you're about as complicated as a goat. You see things in black or white. You tunnel vision. You can't process humor. You don't do very well with spoken language. Men will tend to stutter when they're in that part of their brain. And you know when they're up there like that. When your heart rate in a conflict goes above 100 beats a minute, you end up in what we call diffuse physiological arousal. And in diffuse physiological arousal, you're not acting like a person, you're acting like a reactionary animal. I'm not a good mathematician, but if you talk about correlations, a perfect correlation is a 1. So if I open my hand, this marker will fall to the ground every single time. Never had a marker float. If I ever open my hand and a marker floats, I'm gone. I'm leaving the building, okay? That's a perfect correlation. Every time I open my fingers, the marker will fall. That's a perfect correlation. Diffuse physiological arousal and divorce have a 0.9 correlation. If I'm talking to you and I let my emotions take charge and drive the bus rather than me modulating or regulating my emotions, our track toward divorce is pretty predictable. Now, what happens when you get into a defensive mode, you feel attacked. What happens when you feel attacked? You defend, right? Now, when you begin to defend yourself, you've all of a sudden stopped trying to solve a problem and start trying to win a competition. I got to speak one time at a lunch and learn. Lunch and learn is where you meet people for lunch and they try to learn something. And so they said, we want you to come speak, and we want you to come speak on conflict resolution. I said, cool, where am I going? They said, we want you to go to the staff at the library. I've been a police chaplain for 27 years. And all 27 of those years, I've been assigned to the SWAT team. And I've dealt with some conflict resolution around some very dangerous people. You go into the training center, and there's, machine guns laying around and knives and flashbangs. You go into the conference room at the library, they've got a puzzle on the table. What kind of conflicts do you have at the library? I wasn't sure we needed it, but they asked me to speak on the panel with a guy named Rocco Petrella. And I thought, Rocco Petrella is probably in the conflict resolution business, probably also in the concrete business. Well, it turns out Rocco Petrella's not a gangster. He's another therapist. I was expecting a guy in a gray suit with a carnation. And he does the A, B's, and C's of conflict. A stands for anger, that I get angry. B stands for blame, and I blame it on you. And then C stands for competition. So that you've done something or said something, I've chosen to be angry, but I make it your fault. And because it's your fault, I now have to compete with you and win something. Well, once I get into a competition, it becomes what we call a zero-sum game. And in a zero-sum game, it's I win, you lose. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm happy, you're sad. And so we start into this, okay, you've been contemptuous, or I felt contempt, and then we move into this defensive mode. And in that defensive mode, I'm not trying to solve a problem. I'm trying to win an argument. And that's why a lot of times your conflicts with people degrade into the history, because you're talking about things that you lost before. And so I'm trying to win. In order for me to win, you must lose. In order for me to be right, you must be wrong. By the way, that's the difference in gambling and the stock market. I know a lot of people, when they try to justify gambling, say, well, it's no different than the stock market. Yeah, it's different than the stock market, because we can invest in the stock market and all of us can make money. But if you bet on a ball game, in order for me to win, you must. In order for me to be right, you must be. In order for me to be happy, you must be. And so you get into this competition. Now, once I get into the competition mode and it's I'm right, you're wrong, I win, you lose, what's your default setting in that mindset? I'm right, you're wrong, I win, you lose, I'm happy. I'm being selfish. When we talked about the thing that erodes and degrades all relationships from Philippians chapter 2, and we talked about selfishness, this is where you automatically run problem solving off the rail, because now somebody's been contemptuous and I get defensive, and in order to maintain that posture, I'm only thinking about me, not thinking about you. I'm only thinking about me, not thinking about us. And so once I let selfishness come in because I'm being defensive and trying to win some silly competition, we're not solving any problems now. We're fighting this stupid war over something that may or may not matter. And it really doesn't matter what you're arguing about. It can be something inconsequential. You left your socks on the floor, or something really, really huge. But if you start acting selfish because of defensiveness, you've run the thing out of the lane and into the ditch. Now, the interesting thing is here, because I'm being defensive and I've got to maintain this energy to fight with you, something happens to me cognitively. I start changing my way of thinking. You take a 27-year-old who's a highly charged physical specimen. He's above average intelligence, and you train him and you send him over to the desert. You don't send him over there to kill uncles, brothers, cousins, dads, grandfathers, and nephews. You send him to the desert to kill skinnies and Sammies and ragheads. We did the same thing in World War II. We did the same thing in World War I. We give people labels, because if I think about I'm going over to the desert and I'm going to fight uncles, brothers, cousins, nephews, that's harder to read Dave Grossman's book on combat or on killing. We're not hardwired to kill. In order to make ourselves wired to kill, we have to think about people in different terms. Well, when I start fighting with my spouse, if I think about her as my lover, my girlfriend, the mother of my children, my sweetheart, it's hard to maintain the energy to fight with her. But if I'm already entered into this defensive mode, I'm only going to be thinking about the things that are negative, and she becomes the Wicked Witch of the West. And he becomes the ogre. And he becomes the loser, and she becomes the nag, and he becomes the baby. And all of a sudden, when we start talking with each other and we only focus on the things that aren't right, we change our mindset. There should be a ratio of 5 positive things to every 1 negative thing in your relationship. And you just think about when you measure the story of us, what do you look at? Are you looking Philippians 4:8, whatsoever things are good, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are good report? If there's any virtue, anything praiseworthy, think on these things. Or when you're mad at your spouse, do you think on all the things that they didn't do right and all the things you're unhappy with? Because if you only focus on, and we have to focus on the negative in order to maintain the energy to be in the combat because somebody's attacked us and we're defending. But we only think about the negative, we spiral down into this negativity cascade. And then what happens is it becomes negative sentiment override. Billman talks about the negative sentiment override because he says, now then, everything you do is painted against a backdrop. You guys know what green screening is? Green screening is when your weatherman stands here and points, and he's pointing at a blank screen, but it's New Mexico, or it's the hurricane, or whatever. You've superimposed a backdrop on the news guy. Well, and by the way, there's a guy who does some green screening on YouTube. He's a special effects guy in Hollywood, and he makes these films with this little boy. And it is super entertaining because his son will be on the bed and jaws will come out of the floor. Or they'll play the floor is lava, and the floor really looks like lava. He's green screened all this stuff in. His little boy's jumping from the couch to the divan to the kitchen table, and it's super, super cool. I mean, it's just a little boy's dream. But when you green screen, you decide whether or not you're in a love story or a horror movie. Because you start painting, this is the backdrop of us. Now, what happens with this negative sentiment override, he can come home with a dozen roses, and instead of her going, oh, thank you, she goes, what have you done? Because she immediately assumes the worst of him. And you know, when you sit down and talk with a couple, you know, a couple come to my office and, you know, so you know, tell me about your love story. How did you meet? How long did you date? Tell me about a time when you've been happy. And that little girl goes, we've had problems for so long, we've never been happy. Now, do you hear a problem with that? We've never been happy? About 5 years ago, I threw a wedding. My daughter got married to this young man. The price tag for that wedding, I could have bought a single rope that would go from the top of El Capitan to the bottom. Not that anybody's counting, but just saying, all right? And so the girls go, hey, we need this cake, and we need these special dress for me, and I need these custom-made dresses that all my friends look bad in. I think that's on purpose. And then we're going to cater all this food, and we're going to rent a venue, and then we stand in front of this room, and we practiced it, but we didn't play the whole song in rehearsal. And we kind of forgot how awkward it would be to stand in front of a room full of people and stare at each other while this song played for 9 minutes. But you stand there looking at each other cow-eyed, and then you in front of God and in front of a minister, you say, and I'm going to do everything I can to make you as miserable as possible till one of us dies. You've never had that experience at a wedding, have you? If you were miserable and got married, that's a special kind of stupid. I can't fix that. Okay, you couldn't pick cotton if you was made out of Velcro. So when somebody tells you we've never been happy, I have to challenge that. Because at some point you participated in that whole wedding thing and you looked goo-goo-eyed at each other and you were happy. Otherwise, I can't help you. So don't get fooled in this, we've been so unhappy. You've been happy before. But what happens when you get into negative sentiment override is you don't look at the celebrations, you look at the regrets. You don't look at the things that are joyful, you look at the things that are disappointments. You don't look at us, you only think about me. And so once you have contempt, and contempt moves to defensiveness, and defensiveness moves to negativity, then eventually one of you or both of you will do what's known as stonewalling. And stonewalling is where you're done. You're just numb. See, when somebody tries to do a repair attempt, you can turn toward them, you can turn away from them, or you can turn against them. And when you end up in stonewalling, you're turning away or against someone. Basically, they're trying to fix a situation, and while they're trying to fix a situation, they're building a bridge and you're burning the boards. Now, I told you I wasn't very good at math. My wife went to high school in Ball Knob, Arkansas. I'm not sure that was prophetic, but she went to school in Ball Knob, Arkansas, and I guess they teach math differently in Arkansas. Because she'll come home and tell me, honey, this cost $500, but I bought it for $300. I saved you $200. Now, the way I learned math, we had a teacher from MIT. She married a boy. She had a doctorate from MIT. And she married a guy from Piedmont, Alabama, and ended up teaching high school algebra in Oxford, Alabama. Poor lady. I called her when I finished my graduate courses in behavioral and inferential statistics. I said, may I speak to Dr. Long? She said, this is Dr. Long. I said, Dr. Long, this is Lonnie Jones. She said, the Lonnie Jones? I said, yes, ma'am. She says, and what correctional institution are we dialing from? That's how good I was at math. Okay, but what she taught us in math was there's an integer line. And she said it like a little Yankee, integer line. And these are positive integers, and these are negative integers. Well, when you walk in and show me a checkbook and it has a negative 300, that's a negative integers. 3 Benjamins walked out of my life, never to be seen or heard from again. Nobody put 2 back in my... You didn't save me any money. You spent 3, right? Well, you a brave man, brother. He said it. Now let the record show that was him. So what happens with that is, so we had this discussion about the buying and selling and getting rid of Benjamins. And eventually I realized I'm wrong, Steve. And so I have to go to her and say, honey, last night you saved me some money. And I got a little sideways about it, and I just need to apologize. If she turns against me, well, that's right, you got out, and you nickel and dime me to death, and you want to see a receipt for everything I've ever done. I have a job, too. I make money myself. You get the double hipper and the foot tapper, okay? I've tried to make a repair attempt. Am I going to have to get in the middle of this? I try to make a repair attempt, and she's turning against me. Or I come in and say, honey, you saved me some money last night, and I got sideways out of my lane, and I said things in a way I shouldn't. I'm sorry. And she said, you know, I recognize that we're self-employed, and we're trying to do the Dave Ramsey thing, and you're very conscientious about our financial stability, and I understand how passionate you are about it. Now, I was wrong, but she's accepted my repair attempt. She's turned toward me, not away from me, and not against me. If you can't make repair attempts because somebody's stonewalling, they're turning against you or away from you, then you're in very serious trouble. Because what happens is you end up with a long list of unfinished business. The passage we read from Ephesians, be angry, do not sin. Now, that's not an imperative statement that says, be angry. What it says is, it's like when you see a case of dynamite or a case of nitroglycerin, and it says, handle with care. That sounds like it's the imperative. It doesn't mean you get the thing off the shelf and run around with it. A kid explained to me one time what he called community watch football. You got to understand that I'm a professional counselor, and I deal with people sometimes who have character disorders. This young man invented a game he called community watch football. You go down to Walmart and you buy a very small television. And you keep the receipt in your pocket and you put it under your arm and you roam around the neighborhood late at night and jump fences hoping community watch will chase you. And if they ever catch you, you show them, oh, I paid for the TV, calls it community watch football. I think he'd get shot in my neighborhood. But anyway, you don't play community watch football with nitroglycerin. What that means when it says handle with care is if, for some reason, you have to pull this off the shelf, you be very, very careful with it. Paul says you can be angry, but be very, very careful because anger and danger are very close together. Be angry, and don't let it lead you into sin. And don't let the sun go down upon your wrath, and don't give the devil a foothold. Now that foothold, I read it first and thought, man, that's cool. That's a rock climbing term. Not a rock climbing term. It's a military term. If you send an advanced force, the recon Marines or somebody like that, and they go in and they establish a beachhead, and they build a camp. Well, from that camp, they'll send out a patrol, and that patrol will build another camp. And then that camp sends out patrols and builds another camp. And what they're doing is they're taking over territory. Well, the very first place they got was their foothold in the territory. If I'm contemptuous and I turn away from you because of my negativity and my defensiveness, and I go to bed angry, the devil establishes a base camp. And then he begins to invade territory. He goes from my thoughts to my heart. And from my heart, he takes over my speech, and he takes over my actions. And then this becomes a rotating cycle of negativity and a cascade down into it. And so if you're looking at, okay, when we argue, when we talk about things that aren't right, number one, do I make a positive request to have my needs met? Or do I attack my partner? Is it a complaint? This is something that I think needs to improve, or is a criticism? You're wrong, you're sloppy, you're whatever. And then if you get into that dynamic, whether they're mean to be contempt or not, and you start responding with defensiveness, and by the way, defensiveness is always a way to show that a person is being intellectually dishonest. If I hear minimization, denial, or blame, the person that's doing the talking offers minimization, denial, or blame, they are not trying to solve the problem. They're trying to get out of trouble. Samuel comes up and confronts King Saul. He said, why have you not obeyed the Lord? What does Saul say? I have obeyed the Lord. Outright denial. Well, if you've obeyed the Lord, then why do I hear cattle and sheep? Minimization. Well, I only kept a few cattle. I only kept the best sheep. Well, to obey is better than to sacrifice. Well, you don't understand. The people made me do it. Minimization, denial, and blame. Now look at David. When David is confronted with his sin about Bathsheba, what does he say? Well, read Psalm 51. The entire chapter is his response that I've violated God. And God doesn't want a lot of sacrifices. God wants a sacrifice of a broken and a contrite heart. And so when you see true repentance, when you see somebody who's really not sorry they got caught, not sorry that they're in trouble, not sorry that you're mad, but sorry that I violated the sanctity of us, you won't get defensiveness. You won't get the minimization, denial, and the blame. When we read the passage in Ephesians 4, it's not a apples-to-apples comparison, but notice what he said. Let him who stole steal no longer, but instead let him labor, working with his hands, that he might have something to give other people. Paul says if you've got a behavior that's not working, don't try to defend it. Don't try to make it right. Stop the behavior. Do the opposite. Let the person who is stealing stop stealing. And then let him labor. Let him actually get a job. And then instead of stealing, you not only have what you need, but you have to be able to give to other people. But what happens is we get into this defensiveness, and it's minimization, denial, and blame, and we're trying to prove some point, trying to win some competition, and then in order to maintain our energy to fight, we only think about the things that we're not happy about. We only think about the things that make us sad. We only think about the things that we regret or wish was different, rather than looking at what we do have going for us, and then at some point we stonewall. And I see people turn away from each other, and I see people turn against each other, and normally I can work with that. The reason we use the word stonewalling is when somebody comes into your office and one of them is numb. I just don't have the energy to fix it. I'm not going to go through this cycle. I'm not going to do it again. If they'll get at each other and I have to get between them, I can save that marriage. But when one of the people disconnects and withdraws and goes into I'm absolutely numb, it's probably not a fixable situation until we can revitalize the spark there. Women go through that a lot quicker than men do. At some point, they've gone through the repetitive cycle, and something clicks, and they go, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm just done. And it's very, very hard to recover from. So when we start talking about dealing with conflict, when we start talking about how we handle things, we've got to, first of all, evaluate, hey, in our relationships, when we interact with each other, are we positive for those things? And if you're positive for those things, that is a predictor of catastrophic system failure. And let me just go ahead and say this. If you're a manager and you use these three things in your management style, your company's going to be ruined. If you're a coach and let these things creep into your coaching style, you have a dysfunctional team. If you're an elder and you eld your congregation this way, you're not going to have a healthy congregation. And as a preacher, if all they hear is contempt and defensiveness and negativity, you're not going to have a very healthy congregation either. This is not just true about the dynamics of a marriage relationship. These things affect the dynamics of every relationship. So be very, very careful. Now, if you look at this and you say, okay, I think we're positive for negativity, or I think we're positive for defensive, I think we're positive for contempt, all you have to do is recognize that you've got it and start trying to do some things to change it. I highly recommend the book 7 Principles for Strengthening Marriages by John Gottman. Another book called Why Marriages Succeed or Fail. Those principles are basically echoed in Romans 12, how we interact and how we get along and how we treat each other when we've been sinned against. And it's very worthwhile our reading. Now, when you talk about relationships and how we get along, there are sometimes there's some principles for getting along with each other that doesn't involve conflict. There's some principles that involve that when these things go wrong, I need to understand where my partner is coming from. If you have your Bibles, look at 1 Peter. And we'll do a little more with this chapter. I just want to use this as a jumping off verse. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. Husbands, likewise, are in the same way, live with your wives with understanding. New International Version says, be considerate of your wives. Considerate is the idea of understanding their viewpoint. In conflict, we tend to only want to talk about our viewpoint rather than the other person's viewpoint. This is a thing that we call attunement. Courtney Armstrong calls it alignment. And what happens is a lot of times that in communication styles, I try to make you understand me. And really the most important function of communication is not for me to understand you, not for you to understand me, but for me to try to understand you. And if I can ever make the dynamic of us go from we're looking at each other this way, but we're looking in the same direction with each other, then you feel like that I get you, and you feel like that you are important to me. I'll show you just a simple thing about the thing that we call attunement. When I count to 3, everybody point to your right. 1, 2, 3. Now you notice that I'm pointing in the opposite direction of you. One of us is obviously wrong. Or one of us has a different viewpoint. Now if you were standing where I'm standing, facing the direction I'm facing, point to the right. Now all you did was put yourself in my place and go, I really know my right from my left, but based on the way you're standing, I can point this way with ease. Why? Because I adopted your viewpoint. Doesn't mean you agree with it. Doesn't mean you think I'm right. Doesn't even mean you think I'm rational. You can just demonstrate to me, hey, I get where you're coming from. So when somebody says, hey, I'm unhappy about this and I need it to be fixed, rather than trying to prove your point and say, no, it doesn't need to be fixed, all you have to simply do is say, let me demonstrate to you, hey, I get it. And so there's a little word that Gottman uses, and he calls it attunement, and we'll use that as kind of an acronym for what we're doing. The A stands for acknowledge the emotions that are going on. In the book Just Listen by Daniel Mark Golston, Golston is a hostage negotiator and a corporate consultant with doing some things for large companies, and he says if you can just acknowledge the emotions that somebody else is dealing with. You get a teenager who is just in crisis, and you say, I bet you think nobody else gets how mad, sad, angry, disappointed, upset you are. When you get the right word, you'll see a change in their countenance, and they'll go, yeah, you're right. A lot of times you just simply have to let people know, I know the emotion that you're dealing with. And so when you come in and your spouse is upset, start looking, are you mad? Are you hurt? Are you scared? Are you disappointed? When you talk about mental health, my measure for mental health involves the concept of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is that I understand my emotions and can differentiate between them. A lot of your teenagers, when they are scared, will act angry. When a teenager is acting very aggressive, he's usually insecure and scared. Girls with eating disorders often can't differentiate between mad, sad, angry, and hungry. If I understand my own emotions, if I can put labels on them and talk about them, that's a step toward emotional intelligence. Now, once I understand my own emotions, I respond to my emotions with what we call self-regulation. Self-regulation has 3 prongs. Prong number 1 is delayed gratification. I have this feeling, and instead of letting my feelings drive the bus, I control how I respond to my feelings, and I don't have to get instant gratification. Also, it involves impulse control. I don't have to act impulsive. I'm angry. I don't have to throw something. I get really, really overwhelmed. I don't have to exit the room. So I delay gratification, I have impulse control, and then there's a thing called motivation. And motivation is, do you have the capacity to work hard for a long-term goal, even if it costs you some bad stuff? That's where that skill building, and then it's not the what you're dealing with, but the how you deal with it. So you come in and your spouse is upset, you acknowledge, hey, I sense that you're sad, you're angry, you're scared. Don't tell them what they're feeling. Ask them what they're feeling. And once they tell you, once you acknowledge their emotion, then you can turn toward them. Most of us, men, don't like to get in the emotion pool. Women kind of tread water in it. You know, I get in the emotion pool, and it's at the deep end, and I don't have any floaties on. And so we try to avoid that. You know, we took a bunch of kids camping one time. We took the boys for 5 days. They swapped places with the girls. We kept the girls for 5 days and did the same program, the hiking and the rock climbing and all this kind of stuff with them. The girls got together at this picnic table and played a game called the mood game. They played a board game that involved moods. And the boys wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. So when I come in and Miss Jones is in some kind of an emotional thing, I'm very tempted to go change the oil in everything I own. You know, oh, a few more things out here, but no. You can't avoid that, fellas. When she's in an emotional state, number one, you got to acknowledge it. You got to find out what the label is, and you got to turn toward her. And then you got to tolerate a viewpoint that is different than yours. Doesn't say it's right. Doesn't say you agree with it. Doesn't even mean you think it's rational. You've just got to tolerate it. Jesus is our high priest who can see the world the way we see the world because he was tempted in all points like as we are. We have a sympathetic high priest, the Hebrew writer says. So guys, if we can tolerate and let our wives know, hey, look, I understand how you feel about this, and I want to demonstrate that I understand. Not just tolerate it, but I'm going to respond to you with understanding. Peter says, guys, be considerate of your wives. Dwell with them with understanding. And what that means is you're dealing with them from the standpoint that they believe that you get what's important to them. Now, the difference in them thinking that you get them and not get them is really a key to intimacy. My wife has an irrational belief about spiders. There are only 2 venomous spiders in North America. And by the way, spiders are venomous, not poisonous. Poison is ingested. The venom is injected. So there's no such thing as a poisonous snake. It's a venomous snake or a venomous spider. A guy from Cook's Pest Control taught me that. Anyway, so you don't say poisonous around the Cook's guys, I'll tell you. Anyway, but now when she sees a spider, we don't argue about, honey, look carefully, that's a wolf spider. It's not a brown recluse. It's not a black widow. When we see a spider at our house, you know what happens to the spider? It's tough on spiders, but it makes Miss Jones super, super happy. I've demonstrated that, hey, look, I get how you feel about this, and I understand it, and the only acceptable thing for you in spiders is the spider has to die, okay? Well, you think about if it's visiting my mother, the time you spend with the kids, the time you spend with me. I'd just like it if we drank coffee together in the mornings instead of just running our separate ways like we've busted a covey of quail. Rather than argue about it, rather than try to convince somebody it's not rational, rather than try to prove to somebody that you're right and they're wrong, you just simply say, hey, I'll tolerate that viewpoint and I'm going to demonstrate to you I understand how important it is to you. And because I understand how important it is to you, I will respond to it. And then if you try to explain to me your viewpoint, I'm going to do non-defensive listening. I'm going to let you tell me how you feel, and I don't have to make any defensive. No minimization, no denial, no blame. I'm just going to let you let me know your viewpoint. And once you feel like the other person thinks you're important enough to get, intimacy takes place. And so you acknowledge, you turn towards, you tolerate, you demonstrate understanding, you do non-defensive listening, and then the E is for empowerment or empathy. Sometimes you say, well, what can we do to change this? If this is bothering you or if you don't like this, how can we address it? And you give them empowerment. You say, I'm on your side. I'm a resource you can use, and we can change the world. Or sometimes you go empathy. This can't be fixed. This is something that we can't change. So how do we live with it together? How do we bear this burden together? Now, if you can attune to your spouse what happens with that attunement is you build a level of intimacy. It's not, I feel this way and he doesn't. It's, I feel this way and he supports me. He feels this way and I support him. And at any point that your spouse feels like you get them, then that's an us moment. That's a sharing of things, not a distancing or not a wide gap between each other. Now, before I ran into attunement, I used love. And it's simply the same thing revisited. You listen. I'm going to hear what you say. And by the way, swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, 2 ears, 1 mouth. Should do twice as much listening as you do talking. You listen to understand, not listen to respond. But so many times in our discussions, we listen to respond rather than understand. So I'm going to listen, then I'm going to make some observations. Based on what you've said, you're hurt, scared, disappointed, uncomfortable. I disappointed you, or I hurt your feelings, or whatever. I'm either going to observe or I'm going to challenge that. I may challenge it with either a validation or confrontation. So I've heard what you said. I make this observation that your feelings are hurt, or that you're scared, or you feel insecure, or this made you jealous, and you have every right to feel that way. That's absolutely something that we need to address. I validate it once in a while. If somebody's got a real severe cognitive distortion, rather than validate, I'll slightly confront. Do you really believe I love my job more than I do the kids? Do you really believe I honestly don't like your mother? Because sometimes people have these feelings, and if you make them articulate them on a verbal level, when you confront, you really believe that, they either have to say, I really don't believe that. It feels like that sometimes, but I don't. And then you get back to the empathy or the empowerment. So either one of these I like. I've used this for years. I ran into this with John Gottman stuff, and I kind of borrow it sometimes. But listen, observe, validate, and empower helps us when we start talking about dealing with conflicts. And are you listening to respond, or are you listening to understand? And listening to that understanding so you can demonstrate that empathy, and you can demonstrate that I get the world from your viewpoint. And that's really the power of love, is that love allows us to empathize. When Jesus summed up the law and Jesus summed up the prophets, what did he say? Love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. If I can put myself in your shoes and ask, how would I like to be dealt with? How would I like to be treated? What would I like to happen to me? Then I can attune to you. I can listen, observe, validate, and empower, because I'm functioning from your viewpoint, not from my selfish viewpoint. And learning to see the other person's viewpoint is super, super critical. Everybody you meet knows something you don't know and can see something you can't see. Wise people listen to that. In 1996, we went out to Des Moines, Iowa, to do some flood relief. It was me, a couple of guys from my youth group, and some girls, and we went out to do flood relief. We ended up knocking on doors, and we were going to deliver food and water. The first door we knocked on, the guy said, I need sheetrock. Second door we knocked on, the guy said, I need sheetrock. Third door we knocked on, the guy said, I need sheetrock. We delivered 70,000 pounds of sheetrock that week, me and these 4 teenage boys. The churches sent tractor trailer loads of sheetrock. We go get them at Lowe's, and we delivered it. Well, in the evenings, we'd sit around and talk about we weren't in Alabama, because the 3 guys that I was out that were with me, we had rock climbed together. Do you know what there is to rock climb in Iowa? There's nothing to climb in Iowa except corn stalks and fences. The guy in Iowa said, now you talk about this ropes course. What's the closest thing we have to a ropes course in Iowa? I said, a fence. But it's only this stuff. So we're out there talking about climbing, and there's a dude that went to the church there, and he was a tree surgeon. And he heard us talking about rock climbing. And he said, you guys climb rocks? They're like, yeah, we climb rocks. He goes, I'm a tree climber. And I was like, I climbed trees when I was 8. And I really wasn't rude to the guy, but I really wasn't nice to the guy either. He used hawser-laid ropes. We used braided kern mantle. All the stuff in his equipment box was made out of steel. We use aluminum. He had this leather thing that he called a saddle. I climb in a black diamond bod harness. You put a saddle on a horse, you put a harness on a person, And so, like I say, we weren't rude to him, but we were the cool rock climbers, and he was this rube in a tree, okay? And so we didn't talk to him a lot. I came home from Iowa, and in 1998, I built my first ropes course. You build ropes courses in trees. You know what I'd give for another 2 hours with the dude from Iowa? I'd nearly drive over there and have lunch with him. Because the things that he could have taught me if I'd have just listened to his perspective, there's some things I've had to solve on my own over the last 20 years of being in the ropes course industry. Now, you go to my little truck and you pull out my ropes course harness, it looks like a saddle. It has Hauser-laid ropes and stainless steel equipment and heavy metal stuff. And if I'd have just listened to that guy, so many times when your marriage is in trouble, you look back on it and you go, man, if I'd have just listened to him, if I'd have just listened to her. I heard him say that, I heard her say that, and I didn't look at it from their standpoint. I didn't look at it from their point of view. That attunement allows us to do that, and in doing that, everybody you meet knows something you don't know, can see something you can't see, validate that other person's viewpoint because they're important to you, not necessarily because you agree with it, but because you think they're important. Does that make sense? And then I guess the last thing for tonight is when you get into these problems and you have these differences of opinions, remember that you're in a relationship that's a covenant. It's not just law, but it's a combination of law and love. And it really doesn't matter what you're dealing with. It's really going to determine how you deal with it. And the biggest key of how to deal with it is a commitment. And a commitment is, I've decided I'm going to stay the course regardless of what you do. Your actions don't matter. Coca-Cola wanted to start a signature program. Ronald McDonald houses are internationally famous, because you have this charity where people can go and stay at a Ronald McDonald house if their loved ones are in the hospital. Well, Coke wanted to get on the map. Coke wanted to do a thing, and so they created this idea of Camp Coca-Cola. And at Camp Coca-Cola, the first one ever, they took over this Girl Scout camp in North Georgia. They refurbished the cabins, they wired the place for internet, and they brought 72 kids from inner city Atlanta there, and they outfitted them with everything they needed to camp and hike and live at this camp for like 6 or 7 weeks. The next summer, they're going to take that group of kids and split them in half. They were going to mentor a new group. This group would mentor a new group, and they're going to start this leadership program. And in order to get into Camp Coca-Cola, you had to have good grades. You had to have a reference letter from a teacher. You had to have a reference letter from somebody in your community, and you had to have a reference letter from a minister. Well, I got invited to go to the very first Camp Coca-Cola and run their ropes course. They contacted me from some of my work at Berry College, and so I'm at Camp Coca-Cola working with these little 7th grade kids on a ropes course. This particular day that I've got in mind, we were doing the low elements. And the low elements obviously are the things that you don't need a rope. You can do them on the ground. We do this thing called a trust fall. And in a trust fall, one person stands on a platform, and you're supposed to fold your arms up like this, like you're singing, I'm all wrapped up, tied up, tangled up in Jesus. And you stand on that platform, and you tell your group that's going to catch you, and they stand below you like this with their arms intertwined, and you say, spotters ready, ready, I'm falling, fall on 3, you count 1, 2, 3, and you lean back. There's a really cool thing that happens in a trust fall. Somewhere right about here, you realize, I can't stop this bus. This thing is going to finish what we've started. The other thing that happens is right about here, if it's built right, you think, they didn't catch me. It's over. So you've got Mr. Gravity working on you, and you've got this factor, okay? And so we've got the kids lined up, and we're doing all the safety stuff, and we did some practice leans on the ground, and we've got our first kid up on this platform, and he's about to fall into the arms of other 7th graders. And I look out through the pines, and I see these guys in suits, and it's obviously the executives from Coke. They're there kind of to see what this new program's going to be like. And so, I'm out there in jungle pants and a T-shirt, and I'm sweating, and you hear the suits are. Well, just as this little kid falls off the thing, he reaches that point that says, hey, them fools didn't catch me. And he opens his arms up, and he jacks this dude right in the nose. Little kid, small little guy, looked a little bit Asian. His glasses are broken. They're sitting cockeyed on his head, and he is just pouring blood down his nose. Well, instantly, I've got suits standing around me. Now, I guess we're thinking liabilities and lawyers, and how can we bury this dude? And I'm trying to salvage a situation. And I said, why didn't you move when he slung his elbow at you? And the little guy said, because I made a promise to stand here regardless of what he did. Now, usually when we process one of these elements, we talk about, do you trust people enough to fall into their arms? That ended that day. When we debrief a trust fall, we don't talk about, can you trust people? But we talk about, can you be trusted? And in your relationship, it's not, does your partner keep her vow? In your relationship, it's not, does my husband keep his vow? It's you promise to stand there. It doesn't really matter what you do. I made a commitment that I'm going to stand here regardless of some of your activities. Now, I'm assuming that everything in the New Testament is written about the bell curve of behavior. I don't think the New Testament talks about addicts. I don't think the New Testament talks about narcissism. I don't think the New Testament talks about bipolar disorder. I don't think the New Testament talks about people who are sociopaths. I think we assume that when Jesus is talking to these people, he says there are some ways that you deal with people who are not abusive or toxic. So under that umbrella, you made a promise to stand there. Now, there are some toxic relationships that you can't tolerate because they're going to damage your kids. They're going to damage the spirituality of your kids. But under the bell curve of normal, you got to be like that little kid at Camp Coca-Cola. I made a promise to stand here, and it really doesn't matter what you choose to do. I made a promise not to let this interfere. I made a promise to attune to you. I made a promise to love you. And remember, love is an attitude. And the definition I like to use for love is the personal, intentional investment, and if necessary, costly investment into the good of another that does not consider return of investment and is not predicated on that person deserving being loved. One more time. Love is the intentional and, if necessary, personally costly investment into the good of another person. It does not require a return of investment. Doesn't mean you do something for me. And it is not predicated on the fact that you deserve to be loved. It's a choice I make. It's an attitude I have. And it's a promise I made. And I promise to stand there regardless of how you behave. That's the commitment that keeps our relationships together. That's our bell. So you're dismissed. Thank you very much.